The great hall of the Galactic Council stretched beyond sight with walls that sparkled like captured starlight and floors, made from polished stones that came from worlds humans had never seen. 47 different species filled the massive space with their voices, creating a symphony of clicks and whistles and hums that would have overwhelmed any human ear just 6 months ago. Now, Ambassador Daniel Carter stood at the center of it all, wearing his best diplomatic smile and feeling surprisingly calm despite the weight of his entire species resting on his shoulders. Lisa Morgan adjusted her tablet one more time and glanced at Daniel with eyes that held just a hint of the steel that lay beneath her carefully practiced diplomatic training. She had spent 3 years learning to speak in the soft, measured tones that made other species feel safe around humans, and today was the day all that training would either pay off or fail completely. The humans had been preparing for this moment since first contact 2 years ago, when a Tyrrellian exploration vessel had stumbled across their little solar system and discovered that the third planet was home to a species that had somehow achieved interstellar travel without destroying themselves in the process. The Tyrrellian delegate adjusted his crystalline form to catch the light better as he whispered to his assistant about how remarkably peaceful these humans appeared to be. Their psychological profiles showed all the markers of a highly social species, with strong emotional bonds and an almost disturbing tendency to form attachments with other species for no apparent survival benefit. The humans actually kept other creatures in their homes simply because they enjoyed their company, which struck most council species as either deeply touching or slightly insane depending on their own evolutionary background. Daniel stepped forward to the speaking platform and felt the attention of thousands of beings focus on him like a physical weight. He had practiced this speech hundreds of times in front of mirrors and recording devices and other humans, who all agreed that he sounded appropriately humble and eager to learn from his betters. The key was to project just the right amount of nervous excitement mixed with genuine awe at being included in something so much larger than his own small species. The Corvani representative spread her wings slightly in what humans had learned was a gesture of polite attention, while her compound eyes tracked every movement Daniel made. Her species had evolved from something like a butterfly if butterflies were the size of horses and possessed intelligence that could calculate hyperspace jumps in their heads. She found humans fascinating because they reminded her of her own species in their early days, when they had first learned to work together instead of competing for the same flowering plants. Daniel began his speech with words that had been carefully chosen by teams of linguists and psychologists and diplomats who understood that first impressions with alien species could determine the fate of entire civilizations. He spoke of humanity's desire to learn and grow and contribute whatever small talents they might possess to the greater good of galactic civilization. He mentioned their art and their music and their literature while carefully avoiding any mention of their history books or their military academies or the fact that humans had never encountered a form of warfare they could not eventually master. The speech lasted exactly 47 minutes, which was considered the perfect length for maintaining attention without appearing to waste anyone's valuable time. Daniel talked about human values like cooperation and empathy and the protection of the innocent, while Lisa stood behind him making careful notes about which species showed positive reactions and which ones seemed more reserved. She had trained herself to read alien body language the same way a hunter learns to read the tracks of different prey animals, but she kept that particular comparison to herself. When Daniel finished speaking, the hall erupted in the polite applause, equivalent for dozens of different species which ranged from gentle wing beats to harmonic resonance to the clicking of claws against chitin. The Zephyrian Prime Minister rose from his seat, which was shaped like a crystal formation, and began the formal questioning period that would determine whether humanity would be accepted into the Council or politely asked to continue developing for another few centuries. The questions came in waves covering everything from human religious beliefs to their approach to conflict resolution to their plans for expansion into unclaimed systems. Daniel answered each one with the earnest sincerity of someone who genuinely believed that violence should always be a last resort, and that the best solution to any problem was usually the one that left everyone feeling like they had gained something valuable. He spoke about human children and how much effort his species put into teaching them to be kind and cooperative and protective of those weaker than themselves. What he did not mention was that human children also played games that involved hunting and stalking and capturing territory from other groups of children. He did not explain that human schools taught history classes that spent considerable time analyzing military strategies and studying the rise and fall of civilizations that had failed to adequately defend themselves. He certainly did not bring up the fact that every human child learned from an early age to assess their environment for potential threats and escape routes, because these lessons were built into fairy tales and playground games and bedtime stories that seemed innocent to anyone who had not evolved on a world where everything bigger than a house cat had once considered humans to be potential food. The vote took place 3 hours later after delegates had time to consult with their governments and advisors and military strategists who all agreed that humans appeared to represent exactly the kind of stable cooperative species that would strengthen the council without threatening the existing balance of power. The final tally was unanimous, with even the most cautious species agreeing that humanity deserved a chance to prove themselves as productive members of Galactic Society. Daniel accepted the decision with appropriate humility and gratitude, while Lisa recorded everything for the historical archives that would be studied by human children for generations to come. Neither of them mentioned that they were already thinking about how to integrate human tactical doctrine with the military capabilities of their new allies, or how much they were looking forward to learning about the Council's enemies and their weaknesses and the best ways to hunt them down and eliminate them as threats to the new pact that humanity had just joined. Kepler Station hung in the void like a massive metal flower with petals made of docking bays and a core that housed nearly 50,000 beings from across the galaxy. The station served as a trading hub and cultural exchange center where species that had never shared the same star system could meet and do business and learn about each other without the complications that came with visiting each other's homeworlds. Captain Jake Miller had been stationed there for 8 months and had grown to love the controlled chaos of so many different forms of life trying to coexist in one relatively small space. His security force consisted of 200 humans who had volunteered for what most people considered the galaxy's cushiest military assignment. Lieutenant Amy Foster joked that they were the most overpaid babysitters in known space, since their biggest challenges usually involved breaking up arguments between traders who could not agree on exchange rates or dealing with tourists who had consumed too much of whatever passed for alcohol in their particular biochemistry. The other species seemed to find human presence reassuring, even though none of them could quite explain why a species with such primitive weapons technology made them feel safer. The humans had set up their operations center in a section of the station that offered good sight lines and multiple escape routes, though they told everyone it was chosen for its central location and efficient communication access. Jake spent most of his time doing paperwork and attending meetings with station administrators who wanted to discuss security protocols that never seemed to involve anything more dangerous than preventing pickpockets and making sure drunk aliens did not fall off walkways. Amy ran training exercises that she described as routine maintenance of readiness levels, while carefully not mentioning that her people practiced room clearing and hostage rescue scenarios every single day. The Ravager fleet appeared on sensors at 14:27 station time, dropping out of hyperspace in a formation that immediately told Jake everything he needed to know about their intentions. He had seen similar patterns in human military history books and recognized the classic deployment of a force that intended to overwhelm defenses quickly and then take everything of value before disappearing back into the void. The Ravagers were well known throughout the galaxy as pirates and slavers who struck at soft targets and avoided anything that might fight back with real effectiveness. Station Commander Velkorth was a Tyrillian whose species had never developed a warrior culture, and who genuinely believed that all conflicts could be resolved through careful negotiation and mutual understanding. He activated the emergency protocols that called for immediate evacuation of all non-combatants while sending distress signals to the nearest Council fleet, which was unfortunately 18 hours away at maximum speed. The plan was simple and had worked during previous pirate attacks. Hide the civilians, secure the valuable cargo, and wait for rescue while the pirates took whatever they could carry and left before military reinforcements arrived. Jake listened to the evacuation announcements echoing through the station corridors and felt something cold and familiar settling into his chest like an old friend returning from a long journey. He opened a secure channel to his people and began issuing orders in the calm, professional tone that human military personnel used when they were about to do things that would give civilians nightmares for the rest of their lives. Amy acknowledged his transmissions with responses that sounded perfectly normal to anyone who had not been trained to recognize the subtle shift in human vocal patterns that occurred when predators began stalking their prey. The Ravagers came aboard in 3 waves using breaching pods and cutting torches to open holes in the station's hull while their ships provided covering fire that knocked out most of the defensive turrets within the first 10 minutes. They moved through the corridors with the confidence of beings who had done this many times before and who expected to encounter nothing more dangerous than frightened merchants and civilians who would surrender rather than fight. Their leader was a creature called Gorthek, whose species had evolved from something like a cross between a bear and a scorpion, and who took personal pleasure in the fear he could inspire in weaker beings. Everything changed when the Ravagers reached the civilian shelter areas and began separating the adults from the younglings in preparation for the slave markets that operated in the lawless regions beyond council space. Jake watched through security cameras as Tyrillian children were dragged away from their parents while Corvani cubs were stuffed into cargo containers designed for valuable minerals. The sounds of distress echoed through the station's communication system, carrying frequencies that human ears were not designed to hear but that triggered responses buried deep in human genetics from the days when their ancestors had to protect their own young from predators that hunted in the darkness. Amy's voice came across the comm system with a tone that would have made every human on the station check their weapons and prepare for violence while sounding perfectly professional to anyone else who happened to be listening. She requested permission to deviate from standard council protocols, which were designed for species that viewed warfare as an unfortunate necessity rather than something that could be mastered and perfected through thousands of years of practice. Jake gave his authorization using code words that told his people to switch from peacekeeping mode to something that the galaxy had not seen in living memory. The transformation began immediately as 200 humans stopped pretending to be civilized and remembered what they actually were underneath the diplomatic training and cultural conditioning that had taught them to play nice with species that had never learned to hunt anything more dangerous than plants. Sergeant Kelly Davis moved through the maintenance tunnels with her squad using hand signals that human children learned in playground games but that represented sophisticated tactical communication developed over centuries of warfare. Lieutenant Colonel Brad Thompson accessed the station's environmental controls and began systematically shutting down life support in sections occupied by Ravagers. While maintaining perfect conditions in areas where civilians were hiding, the Ravagers had faced Council security forces before and knew how to deal with species that fought according to rules and regulations and military doctrines that prioritized minimizing casualties and preserving infrastructure. They had never encountered something that viewed their presence not as a military problem to be solved, but as prey animals that needed to be eliminated as efficiently as possible. The humans moved through Kepler Station like ghosts that could see in the dark and shoot around corners and anticipate enemy movements with an accuracy that suggested they could read minds or predict the future. By the time the Council fleet arrived to provide rescue and reinforcement, they found the station secure and the surviving Ravagers in custody waiting to be transported to facilities where they would spend the rest of their lives thinking about what had happened to their friends and wondering how a species that seemed so peaceful could be so absolutely terrifying when something threatened their pack. The security footage from Kepler Station would be analyzed by military strategists and xenobiologists for decades to come. But no amount of study could fully explain what happened when 200 humans decided to stop being diplomats and remembered what their species had been doing for millions of years before they learned to build starships and write poetry. Lieutenant Colonel Brad Thompson had spent the morning discussing Altarian verse forms with a cultural exchange group and reviewing supply requisitions for the station's hydroponics gardens, but when the Ravagers began taking children, he became something that most of the galaxy thought was extinct. The transformation was not visible on the outside, since humans had learned long ago to keep their most dangerous capabilities hidden beneath layers of civilization and social conditioning that made other species feel safe around them. Brad still looked like a mild-mannered logistics officer who collected alien literature in his spare time, but his eyes had gone cold in a way that would have sent every prey animal on Earth running for the deepest cave they could find. He moved through the station's corridors with a fluid grace that seemed almost casual until other humans recognized it as the hunting gait their ancestors had used to run down animals 10 times their size across the African plains. Sergeant Kelly Davis crouched in a maintenance shaft above a group of Ravagers who were arguing about how to divide their captured slaves and felt the familiar calm that came over human hunters when they had found their prey and were ready to strike. Her breathing slowed and her heart rate dropped and her pupils dilated as ancient programming took control of systems that modern humans rarely accessed outside of combat situations or extreme stress. She had spent years learning to suppress these responses during peacetime, but now she embraced them like old friends returning from a long journey. The Ravagers below her were discussing the market value of Tyrillian children when Kelly dropped through the ceiling grating and landed among them with the silent precision of a cat falling on a group of mice. Her sidearm appeared in her hand as if it had materialized from empty air, and she began firing with an accuracy that came from thousands of hours of practice combined with reflexes that had been honed by evolution to help her ancestors survive in a world where everything wanted to eat them. The engagement lasted 17 seconds and ended with 4 dead Ravagers and Kelly already moving toward her next target before their bodies had finished falling. Dr. Rachel Stone had been studying butterfly migration patterns when the attack began, but now she calculated firing solutions and tactical approaches with the same analytical precision she had once applied to tracking insect flight paths across interstellar distances. Her xenobiology training gave her an intimate understanding of how different species moved and fought, which translated into an almost supernatural ability to predict where enemies would be and how they would react to various forms of pressure. She coordinated her squad's movements through the station's residential sections while providing covering fire that kept Ravager reinforcements pinned down long enough for civilians to reach safety, the other species watching through. Security monitors saw something that challenged everything they thought they knew about human psychology and social development. These were not the gentle, empathetic beings who had charmed their way into council membership with speeches about cooperation and mutual understanding. These were persistence hunters who had climbed to the top of their planet's food chain by being better at organized violence than anything else that had ever evolved. Their empathy and emotional bonding were not signs of peaceful nature, but tools that made them incredibly effective at working together to destroy anything that threatened their pack. Captain Jake Miller coordinated the defense from the operations center using tactical skills that he had learned at human military academies where students studied the campaigns of generals whose names were synonymous with victory achieved through superior strategy and ruthless execution. He moved his people through the station like pieces on a chessboard while maintaining perfect awareness of civilian locations and evacuation routes and potential choke points where small groups of humans could hold off much larger numbers of enemies. His voice remained calm and professional throughout the engagement, even as he orchestrated a level of coordinated violence that made the Ravagers' previous raids look like children playing with toys. The Ravagers had brought superior numbers and heavier weapons and years of experience raiding council installations, but they had never faced anything like what the humans became when something threatened their pack. Every human on the station transformed from peaceful civilian into something that moved through darkness like a natural predator while maintaining perfect fire, discipline, and tactical awareness that came from genetic memory of hunting in groups across landscapes where mistakes meant death and success meant survival for the entire tribe. Amy Foster led her squad through the commercial districts where Ravagers were looting valuable cargo while terrorizing merchants who had never seen real violence in their lives. She moved with the patient stalking behavior of something that had all the time in the world to position itself perfectly before striking with lethal efficiency. Her people followed her lead using hand signals and tactical communication that looked like a deadly dance choreographed by evolution and perfected through centuries of warfare that had taught humans to fight as a unified organism with dozens of bodies but a single predatory intelligence. The engagement lasted 4 hours from first contact to final casualty reports, but the real battle was over much sooner when the surviving Ravagers realized they were not fighting civilized beings who followed rules and worried about collateral damage. They were being hunted by something that had learned to apply the same strategies their ancestors used to bring down mammoths and cave bears to the problem of eliminating threats to their pack. The humans gave no quarter and took no unnecessary risks and showed no mercy to enemies who had threatened children and innocents under their protection. When Council reinforcements finally arrived, they found Kepler Station secure and functioning, with all civilian casualties treated and all critical systems operational. The humans had returned to their normal duties as if nothing unusual had happened while the surviving Ravagers sat in detention cells staring at walls and trying to understand how beings that seemed so peaceful could be so absolutely terrifying. When they decided to hunt something, the security footage would be classified at the highest levels while council leaders tried to figure out what they had actually invited into their alliance and whether they should be grateful or terrified that humanity had chosen to consider them part of the pack worth protecting. The emergency session of the Galactic Council convened in the same chamber, where humanity had been welcomed just months earlier, but the atmosphere had changed completely as representatives from 47 species struggled to understand what they had witnessed at Kepler Station. The security footage had been reviewed by military analysts and xenobiologists and psychologists, who all reached the same disturbing conclusion that humans were not what they appeared to be and possibly represented a threat that the galaxy had never encountered before in its long history of interspecies cooperation and peaceful development. Admiral Peter Hayes stood at the center of the chamber, wearing his dress uniform and carrying himself with an authority that made ancient species suddenly feel very young and very vulnerable in ways they had not experienced since their own civilizations had first learned to look up at the stars and wonder what might be looking back. He no longer projected the humble eagerness that had characterized human diplomatic efforts during their application for council membership, but instead radiated the quiet confidence of a predator that had finally decided to stop hiding what it actually was. The Terralian Prime Minister spoke first with a voice that trembled despite her 3 centuries of diplomatic experience and her species' reputation for maintaining calm in any situation. She asked the question that everyone in the chamber wanted answered, but that none of them had dared to voice during the weeks of analysis and debate that had followed the incident. She wanted to know what humans actually were and whether the Council had made a terrible mistake in accepting them as members of a peaceful alliance that had existed for thousands of years. Without major conflict, Admiral Hayes listened to the question with the patient attention of someone who had been expecting this conversation since the day his species first made contact with galactic civilization. He had spent years preparing for the moment when humanity would have to explain itself to beings who had never evolved on a world where everything bigger than a rabbit had once considered them potential food. He understood that most council species had developed in environments where cooperation was rewarded and aggression was punished, by natural selection that favored peaceful coexistence over competitive violence. He began his explanation by acknowledging that humans had not lied about their nature during the application process, but had simply allowed other species to interpret human characteristics through the lens of their own evolutionary experience. When humans described themselves as persistence hunters, the Council had assumed this meant they were patient and determined in pursuit of goals, rather than understanding that it meant they were the descendants of creatures that could run their prey to death across landscapes that stretched beyond the horizon. The revelation sent waves of nervous communication through the assembled delegates, as species began to understand that they had fundamentally misunderstood what humans meant when they talked about their history and their values and their approach to problem solving. Dr. Helen Carter stepped forward with data tablets containing analysis that had been conducted by teams of human scientists working with Council xenobiologists to map the psychological and behavioral differences between humans and other intelligent species in ways that had never been attempted before. She explained that human empathy was not a sign of peaceful nature, but rather an advanced form of tactical intelligence that allowed them to understand and predict the behavior of other beings with an accuracy that made them incredibly effective at both cooperation and warfare. Human emotional bonding created social structures that could coordinate the actions of millions of individuals toward common goals, whether those goals involved building cities or destroying enemies that threatened the group. Human protective instincts toward the young and the weak made them absolutely merciless toward anything that posed a threat to those they had decided to defend. The Corvani representative spread her wings in agitation as she processed the implications of what she was hearing and realized that her species had completely misunderstood the nature of the beings they had welcomed into their alliance. She had interpreted human behavior through the lens of her own evolutionary background, where competition was limited to access to flowering plants and where violence was unknown except as an abstract concept studied in the histories of other species that had developed differently. Admiral Hayes continued his explanation by describing how human civilization had developed through the application of hunting strategies to increasingly complex social problems until humans learned to think of their entire species as a single pack that needed to be protected from external threats. This expansion of pack loyalty explained why humans formed emotional attachments to other species and why they were willing to risk their own lives to defend beings they had never met and who were not genetically related to them in any way. The chamber filled with the sound of nervous chittering and harmonic resonance as species that had never considered themselves prey animals began to understand that they had invited apex predators into their peaceful alliance. The Zephyrian delegate asked whether humans viewed other council species as potential threats to be eliminated or resources to be protected, and whether there was any meaningful difference between those two categories from a human perspective. The question hung in the air like a physical presence while every being in the chamber waited for an answer that would determine whether they needed to prepare for war against their newest members or whether they could continue to trust that human protective instincts would extend to the entire galactic community. Admiral Hayes smiled with genuine warmth as he explained that humans had already made their choice about which category other Council species fell into, and that the events at Kepler Station had demonstrated exactly what humans were willing to do, to protect beings they considered part of their pack. Dr. Carter added that human military doctrine had been completely rewritten since first contact to focus on external threats rather than competition between human groups, and that human strategic planning now operated on the assumption that the entire galaxy was territory that needed to be defended against anything that might threaten the peaceful development of interspecies civilization. She showed tactical analyses that demonstrated how human thinking had shifted from viewing other species as potential competitors to treating them as pack members, whose safety was worth any level of violence against external enemies. The session continued for hours as council representatives struggled to reconcile their understanding of peaceful civilization with the reality of what humans became when they decided something needed to be hunted and killed. The final consensus was that humanity represented something the galaxy had never seen before: apex predators who had learned to extend their protective instincts beyond their own species to encompass any being they considered worthy of defense. The question that remained was whether this development represented the greatest opportunity or the greatest threat that galactic civilization had ever encountered. and whether there was actually any difference between those two possibilities when dealing with beings who hunted for the protection of their pack rather than for personal survival or territorial expansion. 6 months after the revelation at the Emergency Council session, the galaxy had transformed in ways that most species were still struggling to understand as they adapted to a new reality where the apex predators they had welcomed into their alliance were actively hunting threats that had plagued interspecies civilization for millennia. Commander Chris Martin stood on the bridge of the CSS Defiant, which was the first warship designed using human tactical philosophy combined with the technological capabilities of dozens of Council species who had never considered applying their advanced sciences to the problem of organized violence. The ship represented everything the galaxy was becoming under human influence, with Zephyrian sensor arrays that could detect enemies across star systems and Corvani reconnaissance drones that moved through space like invisible butterflies, carrying intelligence back to human tactical officers who processed the information through minds that had been shaped by evolution to think like predators. The Tyrillian crew members provided mathematical calculations for weapon trajectories and hyperspace jumps, while human commanders made the decisions about when and how to apply lethal force against targets that threatened the peaceful development of galactic civilization. Captain Susan Morgan had just finished eliminating the last major Ravager stronghold in the Outer Rim using strategies that combined human military doctrine with Council technology in ways that made traditional piracy impossible for any group that lacked the resources of a major government. Her report to Admiral Hayes described the operation in clinical terms that did not convey the absolute terror that Ravager survivors felt when they realized they were being hunted by beings who could track them across interstellar distances and predict their movements with supernatural accuracy. The transformation had not been easy for many Council species who struggled to reconcile their image of gentle, empathetic humans with the reality of what they became when they identified something that needed to be eliminated as a threat to galactic peace. Support groups formed in major population centers for beings suffering from what psychologists termed predator revelation anxiety, which manifested as nightmares about being hunted and difficulty trusting human friends and colleagues who had never shown any signs of aggressive behavior, but slowly understanding emerged as species began to realize that humans had not deceived anyone about their nature and had simply allowed others to interpret human characteristics through their own evolutionary lens, instead of understanding what those characteristics meant for beings who had developed on a world where survival required the ability to hunt and kill anything that posed a threat to the pack. The humans had been completely honest about being persistence hunters and having no natural predators, but other species had not understood that this meant humans were the thing that other apex predators were afraid of. Admiral Kate Brooks commanded the human fleet that encountered the Void Swarm at the Centauri Nebula, where ancient creatures that had consumed 17 civilizations over the past 1,000 years found themselves facing something they had never experienced before. The engagement lasted 6 hours and ended with the complete elimination of a threat the Council military forces had been unable to contain, despite centuries of effort and the loss of entire star systems too. Creatures that seemed to exist only to consume and destroy. The Void Swarm had evolved in the deep spaces between galaxies where survival required the ability to strip resources from any source of organized matter, but they had never encountered beings who could think like them while possessing the technological capabilities of an advanced civilization and the tactical coordination of a species that had perfected group hunting over millions of years of evolutionary development. The human fleet moved through the nebula like a pack of wolves, eliminating stragglers and cutting off escape routes, while maintaining perfect coordination across dozens of ships and thousands of personnel. Military analysts from across the galaxy studied the tactical recordings and tried to understand how humans could adapt their strategies so quickly to threats they had never faced before. But the answer lay in capabilities that most species had never needed to develop. Humans could think like their enemies because they had evolved as predators who needed to understand the behavior of everything they hunted while maintaining the social coordination necessary to work together in groups large enough to bring down prey that was individually stronger and more dangerous than any single human. The success against the Void Swarm marked a turning point in galactic history as threats that had seemed eternal and unstoppable found themselves facing extinction at the hands of beings who hunted not for territory or resources but for the protection of species they had adopted as pack members. The Devourer fleet that had raided the Spiral Arm for 3 centuries disappeared in a single week when human ships appeared in their home system and began systematically eliminating every vessel and base and supply depot until nothing remained but debris and the memory of creatures that had thought themselves invincible. Council species began to understand that they were witnessing the emergence of something unprecedented in galactic history as humans applied their predatory instincts to the protection of an entire civilization rather than just their own kind. The galaxy became safer, not because humans were peaceful, but because they were incredibly effective at hunting and killing anything that threatened the beings they had decided to protect. Trade routes that had been dangerous for centuries became safe as human patrols eliminated pirates and raiders with efficiency that made criminal activity unprofitable in most regions of explored space. The change went deeper than simple military superiority as human influence began reshaping how other species thought about cooperation and defense and the responsibilities that came with membership in a galactic community. Species that had never considered themselves warriors began developing tactical capabilities under human guidance while maintaining their own cultural values and approaches to civilization. The galaxy was learning to think like a pack with humans, serving as the apex predators who eliminated external threats while other species contributed their unique capabilities to the common defense. The day the galaxy understood that humans were apex predators pretending had become the day that galactic civilization stopped being vulnerable to the ancient threats that had limited its development for millennia. The darkness between the stars was no longer filled with unknown dangers, but with human ships carrying crews of mixed species who had learned to work together as a single organism dedicated to hunting anything that might threaten the peace and prosperity of the worlds they had sworn to protect. The predators had finally found prey worthy of their attention, and the galaxy would never be the same.